When you eat, your body wants to store food energy. Because food energy is coming in, you should store it for a time that you don't have it. And when you are not eating, then insulin falls, and you simply take that food energy that you stored and you burn it. And that's why you don't die in your sleep like every single night. You don't have to eat muffins every 2 hours to survive. Like, it's okay. So if you think about it, now we're eating sort of 10 times a day instead of 3 times a day. So 10 times a day, we are telling our bodies to store fat. It's like, store fat, store fat, store fat, store fat. And then it's like, I wonder why I'm so fat. It's like, because you keep telling your body to do that. And if you want to burn fat, then you gotta tell it to stop burning fat. And again, it's a hormonal signal. It's not a caloric signal, it's a hormonal signal. You gotta let that insulin fall, because it's when the insulin fall that the body's gonna start burning the glycogen, gonna start burning the body fat. If you keep your insulin high, then you'll never do it, because insulin is the signal to go high. And this is the problem with type 2 diabetes, because you get this insulin resistance, which leads to high insulin all the time. So it gets harder and harder to lose weight as it goes. So then as you get in sort of like 40 years in, if you're 60 years old and you've been gaining weight since age 20, for example, you have all this insulin resistance that keeps it high. Even though your diet may be good, you have to fight all those years of insulin resistance. And that's why I also say that obesity is really a time-dependent phenomenon. That is, the longer you have it, the harder it is, which the caloric theory completely sort of ignores. That is to say, if you gain 10 pounds from where you are right now, you could lose that pretty easily. Yeah. But if somebody is 65, it's pretty hard to lose that 10 pounds because they've always had it, and it's this sort of chronic resetting upwards of this body set weight that's the problem.
Hey my friend, it's Mike Mutzel here. Thanks so much for showing up and tuning in to yet another video. This episode is proudly sponsored by Somnifix, one of the manufacturers of the world's only hyperallergenic mouth tape that will get you sleeping like a baby again. I'm wearing this shirt right now to help promote the power of nose breathing and really discourage mouth breathing while you're sleeping. Because if you're sitting there with your mouth wide open while you're sleeping, well, guess what? You're not going to achieve those deep phases of restorative sleep that are going to help you burn fat better, become better fat adapted. And if you are breathing through your mouth while you're sleeping, you're probably going to be activating cortisol and free radical stressors within your body. So that's where mouth taping can come in. And what makes Somnifix a really unique product is it's made of hyperallergenic mouth tape that was studied at Harvard, and the adhesive does not cause any irritation to your lips, and it has a small little pierce in there so you can speak to your partner, your spouse, your children, and your loved ones. So please help support the show and get your sleep on track by going to somnifix.com. Again, that's somnifix.com, SOMNIFIX.com.
Dr. Fung, thanks so much for coming back on. It's great to be with you again.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So that last interview we did, it was, let's see, not Memorial Day, I'm thinking of Remembrance Day of 2016. Oh, okay. So you're wearing your lapel. People were asking about that in that video. Remember that?
No, I don't really.
Yeah, it was like early November. There's a whole week of Remembrance Week.
Oh, yeah. The poppy.
The poppy. Yeah, people were asking, like, what's up with that flower? And so we didn't talk about that. So anyway.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Almost 18 months ago. And I was looking through the comments. There was thousands of comments because there's such great content that you shared. And people were curious, or one of the top comments that would keep coming up was, did this doctor really just say that the calories in, calorie out model does not govern whether someone loses weight or gains weight? And so we're talking offline how there's really no receptors for calories in the body.
Yeah, and this is the thing that's very strange. So you take a concept from physics. So what calories is that they take a piece of steak or whatever, and they basically burn it and see how much energy it is. So you can determine how many calories are in a steak and a piece of broccoli or a piece of wood for that matter. So you just burn it and see how much physical energy there is. So the body has no receptors. It doesn't measure calories. It has no idea how many calories you eat. So if you eat a piece of wood, it might have 10,000 calories, but you're not going to absorb any of it because it goes right through you. If you eat steak, it's going to have a certain number of calories. If you drink cola, it's going to have a certain number of calories. If you drink Diet Cola, it's going to have 0 calories. But the body doesn't actually know that because it has no way of measuring it. So it has no way of responding to it. So why would we think that this is a sort of an important concept? And the only reason we think that is because it's sort of been ingrained into us. But it's a concept of physics, and it's not a physiologic concept. If you put 100 calories of sugar in your mouth versus 100 calories of olive oil, the physiologic response is completely and utterly different. So you put that oil into your mouth and drink it down, for example, and there's no insulin response, for example. You eat a brownie, which is the same number of calories, and insulin spikes way up. So the body responds to hormones. I mean, everything runs on hormones, thyroid hormone, insulin, all these different hormones, and that's how it knows what to do. So when it senses that you're taking in carbohydrates, for example, then insulin will go up. If it senses that protein is coming in, insulin will go up as well as something like mTOR. So there's different receptors for amino acids, there's different receptors for fat, there's different receptors. So if you eat fat, for example, you'll have cholecystokinin release. If you eat a lot of fibrous foods, you'll have stretch receptors in your stomach which are activated. So there are all these different things that the body does respond to, but calories is not one of them. So therefore, it really has no idea. You can look on all these different, these diagrams of metabolism that we've done, and you can go on Google and you can find, hundreds of diagrams of metabolism. You see the Krebs cycle, you see acetyl-CoA, you'll see insulin receptors, you'll see all kinds of things, amino acids, fatty acids, all kinds of things. And in nowhere in the last sort of 500 years of human physiology have we described the calorie receptor. It just doesn't exist, right? And so the entire concept is sort of borrowed from physics and sort of made a little bit of sense, not a lot of sense, but it just keeps being repeated, so people think that it's true. But again, 100 calories of broccoli is not the same as 100 calories of donuts. That's just the bottom line. And we all try and pretend that it is, but it isn't. And that's where we've really failed. So if you believe that calories is what's really important, then all you need to do is switch over and drink diet soda, have that fake fat, olestra that we used to have, eat fake food with 0 calories, and there are lots of them. So we've done it for sort of 30 years. I mean, Diet Coke's been around for a long time. And there would be no obesity crisis. But it's worse than ever. So it's like, okay, well, what people never really get is that the bottom line is that you have to have results. If you think that cutting calories is what's really important, and we've told people this is important for the last sort of 20, 30 years, well, what's happened? Well, obesity has gone like through the roof. So clearly this entire notion is completely false. And that's where we're getting into trouble, because we're following the wrong path. We're so obsessed with calories that we forget about everything else. We say, yeah, you can eat donuts for dinner because it's the same number of calories as if you had that kale salad. I'm like, you've got to be an idiot to think that eating donuts for dinner is a good idea and equally as fattening as eating kale salad. There's nothing the same about them. The minute it goes into your mouth, there's nothing the same about those two foods. So you got to follow the physiology rather than this sort of foreign notion of physics that we've sort of imported in. I mean, why don't we say, for example, that it's all due to the weight of food. If you eat half a pound of food, you will gain half a pound of weight.
Yeah. Depends what you're eating and the hormone response.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. I mean, that's the law of thermodynamics too. First law of thermodynamics, you can't gain a pound of weight if you've only eaten half a pound of food. If you've eaten half a pound of food, you must weigh half a pound more. There's simply no way around it. But of course, that's stupid because you get metabolism. There's metabolism. Some of it's going to be exhaled as carbon dioxide. Some of it's going to go through your stools. There's all this physiology that happens when you go from physics to physiology. But the whole calories thing is just like it's just so ingrained into us from the time we're like 2 years old that we really can't let go of this notion, and that's where we're really getting into trouble.
Yeah. Do you think part of that is the food industry? Because people go to the grocery store, buy packaged food, so they look at calories, and so it's like indelibly inked. I mean, it's going to take a long time for people to unwrap their.
Absolutely, it was all driven by the food industry in my mind, because it's not driven by the scientists, other than those who have been paid off by the industry, because what they want to do is equate in our minds that it's all calories, so that you can say you can eat donuts for dinner, and then, hey, why don't you buy these donuts? It's a lot tastier than that salad you're going to eat. And if it's 200 calories of donuts and 200 calories of salmon, hey, same thing. It's a lot cheaper, it tastes better. Just eat that donut and it's great. So of course they love this sort of idea. And the beverage business, for example, it's like, yeah, you can drink Gatorade and then go bicycle for an hour and you'll work it all off. It's the same, it's all equivalent. When you try and make them equivalent, what you don't understand is that if you drink that sugary drink, you're gonna get fatty liver, you're gonna get insulin resistance. You can exercise your muscles, but you can't exercise your liver. Your liver's dying, your muscles are doing great. So it's like, okay, well, in the end, you get all these athletes like Professor Tim Noakes, who's running marathon after marathon after marathon and then gets type 2 diabetes. It's like, okay, well, how does that work? It works because the whole calories notion is false. And that's one of the things that we have to understand. Yeah, maybe it's, maybe I over-exaggerate a little bit for effect, but you really can't use that calories notion. It's not a helpful notion, and if it was, we would be doing a lot better than we are sort of today.
And the longer term epidemiological studies have teased this out, and reducing calories affects resting metabolic rate, which I want to get into. But first, there's kind of two examples. I want to talk about insulin, and then also if someone is eating the right amount of macronutrients but is in a calorie excess, but yet is keeping their hormones in balance. So we've seen this, a lot of people on the internet are doing like 5,000 or 4,000 calorie a day keto, diets, and they're not gaining fat because their hormones are in balance. So how do you feel about that?
I think you can do it. Now, it all depends on what happens. You got to realize that for most of sort of human history, people didn't count calories. Calorie intake varies widely. Nobody eats sort of like 2,000 a day every single day. Honestly, I have no idea how many calories I eat in a day, and most people don't either. Even when they try and count it, they're wildly inaccurate. The idea is that the body works as a negative feedback loop, and that's how we maintain stable weight. So let's go back to the 60s. The 60s, nobody's exercising, and weight is quite stable for the most part in a very good range, like in a non-obese or overweight sort of a range. So how does that work? Because if you think that you can match your calorie expenditure and your intake to that degree that sort of 2% of the population is obese, but you're taking 2,000 calories a day in a year times 365, it's 70,000 calories in a year. A pound of fat is roughly 3,000 calories. So you're matching it to less, like sort of a 99.5% accuracy without any idea of how many calories you're either eating or you're spending. It's like, there's no way that's possible. So there's obviously a negative feedback loop, and what that is, it's like a thermostat. So a thermostat is a perfect example of a negative feedback loop. So you set your temperature at, say, 72 degrees, which is room temperature. If it's summer and it's hot, then the thermostat senses it's too hot and turns on the air conditioning, brings it back to 72. If it's winter and it's really cold, temperature in the house drops to 69 degrees, the thermostat senses that, turns on the heat, brings it back up. So it's a negative feedback loop, and that's a perfect example of homeostasis. The body does exactly the same thing. And there's a very similar body set weight. So we have a mechanism in our body that determines how fat we get. So if you get too fat, you're not gonna survive, because you're not gonna be able to catch food, or somebody's gonna eat you. If you get too skinny, you're also not gonna survive, because you can't take it when there's no food. Like the winter time, there's no food, you're gonna die. So the body actually sets a certain set weight, which is defended very vigorously, actually. So if you get too fat, your body will actually turn on and try and burn off those calories. And we've proved that through lots of studies. So if you deliberately overfeed people to gain 10% body weight, they'll actually burn 500 calories per day more than if they're at their normal weight. Then you drop them to their normal weight, and their basal metabolic rate goes back to the same one. If now you make them lose 10% of their body weight, they're actually burning 300 calories a day less than they did when they were normal weight. So you see that the basal metabolic rate goes up and down depending on where it is. But the body has this mechanism that if you get too fat, it's going to burn off those calories so you get back to normal weight. The more sort of situation we deal with more is that you're trying to lose weight and the body tries to make you gain that weight back. So the key is not to look at the calories. So let's take an example of the thermostat. We know there's a negative feedback loop there. If you have a temperature of 72 degrees and it gets too hot, then what's going to happen is that the body will turn on the air conditioning. If you, for example, put in a bunch of heaters, you can bring it back up. So say you're at 72 degrees and you say, okay, now I want to be 75 degrees. But instead of changing that thermostat, you just bring in a couple of heaters. Well, that's great. You'll go from 72 to 75. But then the thermostat is going to turn on the AC. And then it's going to bring it back down to 72. So you say, okay, well, that didn't work. So instead of one heater, I'll bring in 2 heaters. You bring it up to 75, it brings it back down. And you keep fighting yourself. That's exactly what we do with our body. So we have say our body set weight is 200 pounds. But we don't want to be 200 pounds. We want to be 180 pounds. So you lose weight, you count your calories, you lose weight, go down to 180, and what does the body do? Well, the body makes you hungry, and then it slows down your metabolism in an effort to get back up to the 200 pounds. So then you say, okay, well, now I've got a lot of willpower, so I'm going to cut my calories even further. So you cut your calories further, and what happens? The body makes you hungrier, and it slows down your metabolic rate even more. So you're constantly fighting yourself rather than adjusting that body set weight. So it's not about calories, it's about this body set weight. Because the way it works is that insulin is going to make you gain fat, but if your fat cells expand to a certain point, they're going to generate leptin. So leptin goes into the brain and it says, hey, we're too fat, and turns down the appetite right down. Okay? So as your appetite goes down, you don't eat. If you don't eat, insulin goes down. So perfect. Here's your negative feedback loop.
Hi there, it's me again with a quick announcement from our show sponsor, Health IQ. As you know, they're a progressive life insurance company that rewards healthy people like you and I for participating in our own health. By exercising, walking, getting good, deep, restorative sleep, breathing through our nose while we're sleeping, embarking on a low-carb, ketogenic style diet, weightlifting, we can cut our risk of diabetes, heart disease, and cancer by orders of magnitude. And that's how we can save money on our life insurance premiums. I would encourage you to see if you can get a free quote and see if you qualify by going to healthiq.com/HIH. Again, if you have dependents, loved ones, and a family, you need life insurance, please visit healthiq.com/HIH to get a free quote and see if you qualify. Now let's dive back into the show.
You eat, insulin goes up. When you're too fat, leptin turns on and turns off the insulin. So it works perfectly. What happens though is that if you hijack that mechanism, now all of a sudden you stimulate insulin all the time. So you go to 1977, the government says eat lots of bread, because remember they said eat 50% carbs, 55 to 60% carbs. Right. If they're eating broccoli, you're good. But if you're eating white bread, and you should see the original dietary guidelines, they're all white bread and spaghetti. Yeah. And so you're supposed to eat that 5 or 6 times a day. So insulin's going through the roof. But not just that, but people went from eating 3 times a day to 6 times a day. That wasn't in the guidelines, but that did happen. So now you're stimulating, every time you eat, assuming you eat a mixed meal, you're going to stimulate insulin. Assuming you have some carbs, some protein, some fat. Yeah. You're going to stimulate insulin. So not only are you stimulating insulin more, you're stimulating it all the time. So what happens is that if you stimulate insulin all the time, you get insulin resistance. Your fat cells get big. It turns on leptin. Leptin, if you stimulate all the time, you get leptin resistance. Same thing. We know that because in obesity, what you have is not a lack of leptin, but a total lack of response. So it's a leptin resistant state. So now your negative feedback loop is completely busted, because insulin, you're eating a diet, lots of carbs, eating all the time. your insulin is going up through the roof, and leptin goes up, but there's no response. So now your negative feedback loop has busted, and you're just going to gain weight. So that thermostat, that body weight thermostat, is gradually getting reset upwards.
Higher and higher and higher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then if you simply try, so the important thing is that, how do you reset that? Well, it's a balance between insulin and leptin. You can't do much about leptin, so you really got to attack the insulin side and really lower it. But if you simply say, and here's where we made a huge mistake. So you're eating 2,000 calories a day. Now you say, okay, I want to cut 500 calories. I'm going to cut the fat out, because that's what the government told them. I'm going to cut the fat.
It's high
out.
calorie.
Exactly. So the whole calorie thing is like, okay, I've cut my calories because I've cut so much fat out of my diet. That fat had practically no insulin response anyway.
Yeah.
And instead of eating 3 times a day, I'm going to eat 6 or 7 times a day, because somebody told me that you have to eat all the time. You should eat 6 meals a day. So not only are you're not affecting your insulin, because you're eating foods that are generating the same insulin effect, and you're getting more insulin effect because you're eating all the time. So you're eating less calories but having the same insulin effect, and then wondering why your weight is going up, because you never corrected the problem, which is this balance between insulin and leptin. You need to get your insulin low for a significant amount of time and get your leptin to get low. And that takes a long time, because that is reset upwards very, very gradually. So if you think about standard sort of common obesity, it's about a pound of weight gain, 1 to 2 pounds per year, which adds up over 3 decades sort of thing. But that's this gradually reset upwards. So can you move it all back down in like a month and a half? Not really. It's a long-term process. There's this really fascinating study about eating habits, and one of the things that I've always talked about in in the obesity code is that it's not simply what we eat. So if you look at the foods that we should eat, there's really not that much disagreement. Nobody really thinks you should be eating a lot of white bread anymore. So if you look at, we all sort of agree, unprocessed foods are good, natural fats are sort of back. So there's less, avocados and nuts. There's not that much controversy. Around the edges, like saturated fat and so on, there's still some controversy. But if you look at what people say we should eat, it's not that different.
Right.
But the thing we never talk about is the when to eat. If you look at 1977, how often people were eating, it's about 3 times a day. So I grew up in the 70s, breakfast, lunch, dinner. You wanted a snack, your mom said, no, you can't have a snack, we don't have snacks, and you're gonna ruin your dinner. You want an after dinner snack, they're like, no. And if you got hungry, it's like, you should eat more dinner. That's exactly what they would have said. Yeah. And if you look at the latest data, so 2004, 2005, the NHANES study, which is this giant sort of American survey, it's closer to 6 times a day average. In 2005, a couple of years ago, they had this really interesting study where they gave somebody a smartphone app, and people would just record when they ate and how much they ate, sort of thing. And they looked at how often people ate. And they broke it in by deciles, so the top 10% of people and the bottom 10%. So the bottom 10%, the 10% of people who ate the least frequently, averaged 3.3 times. That is 90% of people ate more than 3 times a day. And the top 10% of people, how often they ate was 10 times a day.
Wow.
It's ridiculous. We're eating all the time. So again, if you think about it, the way human nutrition is not that complicated. When you eat, your body wants to store food energy. Because food energy is coming in, you should store it for a time that you don't have it. And when you are not eating, then insulin falls, and you simply take that food energy that you stored and you burn it. And that's why you don't die in your sleep like every single night. It's like, yes, you don't have to eat muffins every 2 hours to survive. Like, it's okay.
Yeah.
But that's the way nutrition is. So if you think about it, now we're eating sort of 10 times a day instead of 3 times a day. So 10 times a day, we are telling our bodies to store fat. It's like store fat, store fat, store fat, store fat. And then it's like, I wonder why I'm so fat. It's like, because you keep telling your body to do that. And if you want it to burn fat, then you got to tell it to stop burning fat. And again, it's a hormonal signal. It's not a caloric signal. It's a hormonal signal. You got to let that insulin fall, because it's when the insulin falls that the body's going to start burning the glycogen, going to start burning the body fat. If you keep your insulin high, then you'll never do it, because insulin is the signal to go high. And this is the problem with type 2 diabetes, because you get this insulin resistance, which leads to high insulin all the time. So it gets harder and harder to lose weight as it goes. So then as you get in sort of like 40 years in, if you're 60 years old and you've been gaining weight since age 20, for example, you have all this insulin resistance. Then, of course, the whole problem is that you have all this insulin resistance. It keeps it high, even though your diet may be good. You have to fight all those years of insulin resistance, and that's why I also say that obesity is really a time-dependent phenomenon. That is, the longer you have it, the harder it is, which the caloric theory completely sort of ignores. That is to say, if you gain 10 pounds from where you are right now, you could lose that pretty easily.
Yeah.
But if somebody is 65, it's pretty hard to lose that 10 pounds, because they've always had it, and it's this sort of chronic resetting upwards of this body set weight that's the problem. So actors in Hollywood do it all the time. You see people, they gain like 10 pounds for or 20 pounds for a role, and then they drop it, and no biggie. Of course, they just gained it like 2 weeks ago. They can lose it, no problem.
Right, because their set point was relatively normal going
Their
into
set
it.
points here, it takes time, it hasn't really gone up, but they've force-fed themselves to gain that weight for whatever movie role they have to do. So their body weight's here, but their set point's here. So then they simply stop eating because leptin's too high. They stop eating because they really don't want to eat, and they just drop. And we saw that in experiments with in the 1960s with the overfeeding studies. So those are fascinating, because they took these college kids and they said, we want you to gain weight. So this was an interesting story, because Ethan Sims, he wanted to study obesity. So he said, okay, well, you know what? I'll make these rats gain weight. So he just gave them food and they wouldn't gain weight. When they're full, they stopped. Which is exactly what happens in like the 1960s, of course. People ate until they're full and they stopped. The key, of course, is they're not eating all the time. So he thought, okay, well, I can't make these rats get fat. That's weird. I thought it was pretty easy. So he got these college kids and he said, I want you to gain like 10% of your weight. And they all thought it'd be easy. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't gain weight. So he went to prison and he said, okay, I'm going to take these people in prison and make them gain weight. He made sure they didn't exercise too much. He had people watch them as they ate, because their liberties were being restricted. So they gained weight, but it's really, really hard. There's one guy, he eventually gained sort of 25% of his body weight. He was eating 10,000 calories a day.
Wow.
So you think, okay, what's going on? He normally ate 2,500 calories a day, for example. He went up to 10,000. But as he went up to 10,000, his body set weight was down here, and his body is actively trying to burn off all those calories that are coming in. Now, you can't make up that many calories, so he did gain weight. What happened? When the experiment stopped, his body set weight's down here, he's up here, boom, he lost all that weight in like 2 months without effort.
It's crazy.
It's crazy.
Wow. A lot of bodybuilders, not to interrupt you, but a lot of bodybuilders use insulin to put on mass. Because you're at 190 pounds, you want to be a professional on stage at 285. There's a long way to go, right? So they use insulin and a lot of anabolics to actually rev up so that they can physically eat that much food.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. A lot of people will say like, oh, I just have a sluggish metabolism. And I remember reading some studies about that. Like overweight people, their metabolism's not slow. They're just storing more than they're burning,
Yeah.
So that's really interesting about increasing the food intake. The body will compensate and will speed up resting metabolic rate. But one thing how can we mentally unravel the difference between calorie restriction, I want to lose how many pounds, so I'm going to only eat 1,200 calories per day, and intermittent fasting, and how calorie restriction reduces your resting metabolic rate, but intermittent fasting does not. Help us navigate that.
Yeah, that's a common question, and the point is that calorie restriction, first of all, the body really has no idea what the hell you're doing. So you restrict calories, but the body does whatever it wants because it responds to hormones. intermittent fasting is not about how many calories you eat, it's about the time that you're not eating. So you're not eating for 12 hours or 16 hours or 24 hours or 7 days. And people always think that, if I only eat once a day, for example, and I eat 1,200 calories, well, that's exactly the same as if I eat 1,200 calories through that day. No. The difference is that if you, let's do a thought experiment.
Yeah.
If you eat sort of, equal size portions of food sort of every hour, throughout the whole day, is that really the same as eating that one portion through that whole, all at one sitting? And it's not really, because every time you eat, you kind of stimulate your insulin to go up, and you keep telling your body to gain weight. When you drop your insulin enough, what's going to happen is that you're going to tell your body to switch fuel sources. Okay, so when you're eating all the time, you're fueling your body on the food that's coming in. So you eat 2,000 calories, you burn 2,000 calories, that's all food that's kind of going in and out, and it's going through the short-term storage and the glycogen, sure. But if you let your insulin fall low enough, then what happens is that you switch into burning fat. So after you get through your glycogen, then you get into your body fat, and that's where you start to see the ketones and all this sort of stuff. But you know that you're burning fat. So for example, if you're switching fuel sources, there's no reason for your body to slow down. So again, let's take some numbers. So if you have a 2,000 calories a day, and you eat 1,200, but you're eating all the time, and you're keeping your insulin high, either because you're injecting it or you have insulin resistance and your insulin's high. So your insulin is high. Insulin blocks lipolysis. So what that means, and we've known this again for 50 years, insulin stops you from burning fat. Why? Because insulin is telling your body to gain fat. So you don't want to burn fat and gain fat at the same time. So we say insulin inhibits lipolysis. So if insulin is high, but you're only taking 1,200 calories, you have no access to your fat stores, right? Because it blocks lipolysis. Insulin is high, you can't burn fat. So all you have coming in is 1,200 calories. All you can burn is 1,200 calories. Your metabolic rate must slow down in order for you to survive, because you don't want to die. What happens now if you allow your insulin to drop? Say you go on a 7-day fast, and so you have 0 calories coming in for 7 days, and I choose this not because I recommend it, it's fairly extreme in some cases, but if you have insulin resistance, at least I know your insulin will fall. So as your insulin falls, then you're going to switch from burning food to burning fat. That's what's supposed to happen. So if your body now sees, okay, I'm burning body fat, there's like tons of this stuff.
Yeah.
Why do I need to slow down my metabolism? In fact, if you look at the physiology of fasting, it actually maintains the metabolic rate, because as insulin falls, you get a counter-regulatory hormone surge. And again, this is sort of basic physiology. Insulin falls, the body increases sympathetic tone, so the sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline and noradrenaline, growth hormone, and cortisol. We know that, that's pretty basic, because that's trying to get the glucose back out from the liver into the blood. And those hormones, the sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline, cortisol, growth hormone, are trying to push the glucose out. Well, what do you think adrenaline does? That's not slowing your metabolic rate.
Right.
It's pumping it up. And why does growth hormone go up? Well, growth hormone is there because you have a period of gluconeogenesis at around 24 hours. So if you look at the physiology of fasting, the glycogen stores, which are chains of glucose in your liver, that's the first sort of stuff you go to. When you burn through your glycogen, it lasts for 24 hours. At 24 to 36 hours, roughly, you're going to burn protein. And that's where everybody says, oh, you're burning muscle. No, you're burning protein. That's not necessarily muscle. There's a lot of excess connective tissue. There's a lot of excess fat that you should burn. If you look at those, documentaries of people who lose weight, they have all this excess skin.
Yeah.
Well, that needs to be burned. And you want to burn that. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. You want to get rid of that. Same thing with autophagy. You want to get rid of this protein. But if you keep getting rid of protein and never putting it back in, that's not good either. So what does the body do? The body's not that stupid. What it does is it pumps up growth hormone like you can't believe. It goes up like 3 to 5-fold on a 5-day fast.
Wow.
And what it means is that when you eat again, you're going to rebuild that protein. But not the protein that you didn't need, that excess skin that you didn't need. The stuff that you do need. And same thing for autophagy, same thing for cancer cells, same thing for Alzheimer's, plaque, and so on. You actually have the ability to break down this protein that you don't want. And that's why a lot of these people, there's a lot of research going on into autophagy, caloric restriction in terms of longevity. I mean, there's the whole calorie notion, which is not really physiologic, but it's the same thing. You really want to burn off this excess protein that's not making you good, because if you don't ever let your body break down this protein, you can't actually build new protein. Because it's like if you have a bathroom that you want to renovate, the first thing you got to do is pull out that sort of avocado green tub that was sitting from the 1970s. If you don't pull out that tub, you can't put in a nice new clawfoot tub. You have to get rid of it first.
Yeah.
And that's the way the body works. If you look at turnover of bone, there's osteoclast and osteoblast. The first thing you do when you remodel bone is chew up the old bone. Then you lay down new bone. And that's healthier than keeping the old crappy bone there, just like that old avocado green tub. So you have to break it down to rebuild it. And that's what fasting does. It actually breaks down the protein. Growth hormone goes through the roof, and so does noradrenaline. And some people have so much energy, they're like, I can't sleep. I'm like waking up at like 3 a.m. and, doing all this work. I'm like, one is like, that's great if you want, but if you can't, then that's just one of the things that happens. But what you're doing is you're allowing access to those energy stores, those fat stores. Remember, fat is simply food that's stored away for you to use when there's no food available. Now that you've dropped your insulin, you're allowing your body to access all those huge stores of energy, and the body's going crazy. And it's like, yeah, I'm going crazy. I'm going to do this. So it burns it all off. And at the same time, it's breaking down this protein. When you eat again, growth hormone is so high, you're going to rebuild your protein. So when you look at clinical studies of weight loss, you actually get much better retention of lean mass with an intermittent fasting strategy than a standard sort of cut 500 calories per day. And these are the sort of myths that are out there. The myth that your metabolic rate is going to go down. It's actually the exact opposite. Fasting does much better in terms of preservation of metabolic rate. You're going to lose all this muscle. It's completely false. It's actually the opposite. If you try to lose weight with standard calorie restriction compared to intermittent fasting, and the studies are there, then you will do much better by doing the fasting, because you're cycling the sort of energy source. You're allowing your body to access those energy stores rather than keeping insulin high, shutting it away, and then saying, okay, you can use whatever energy is coming in through the mouth. And it's like 1,200 calories. Well, you burn 1,200 calories, and that's the real problem. Is that the body, and we saw this in the Biggest Loser. So these Biggest Loser diets, so they lose a lot of weight.
Yeah.
And a lot of fat, which is great. But the problem is that their metabolic rate just kind of sank like a stone. So you had one poor guy who was burning 3,400 calories a day, went down to like 1,800 calories a day.
It's a massive drop.
It's a massive drop. Yeah. I mean, he lost a lot of weight too. But then the problem is that the body's used to burning this amount of calories. So say you normally take 2,000 calories. Then you go on this 1,500 calorie a day caloric restriction diet. Your body now can only burn 1,500 because you haven't dropped your insulin. You haven't solved this sort of hormonal imbalance. You're trying to solve this calorie imbalance, but it's not a calorie imbalance. You got the wrong problem, so you got the wrong solution. So you drop your calories. Now the body, insulin's still high because you're cutting fat and you're eating 6 times a day. So your insulin's high, you have no access to body fat. You, instead of burning 2,000, you're burning 1,500. Guess what? You're going to feel cold. You feel sluggish. Your hair may fall out. Your nails might get brittle because everything takes energy. Your heart needs to pump, your blood pressure, your liver, your kidneys. and you've put them on this sort of restriction. So you're cold, and then your body makes you hungry. You know that ghrelin goes up. Your body makes you hungry because it wants to get back up to that weight. And your metabolic rate's slowing, so you feel cold, you feel tired, you feel hungry, you feel like crap. And you've stopped losing weight because your metabolic rate has gone down, not to 1500, it usually goes down to like 1450 or something like that.
Yeah.
So now you're actually starting to regain that weight. So you're on 1500 calories, your body's moved its metabolic rate from 2000 to 1450, you're regaining that weight. You said, forget it, I'm going to go back up to 1700 calories. Now you just pile on the weight because you're still at 1450, and you're still feeling like crap because you're used to burn 2000, and your weight's all back to where it was. It's like, sound familiar?
Yeah.
Well, guess what? That's what every single dieter does. Why not instead do the intermittent fasting, drop your insulin levels very low for a period of time, whatever time it is, 16 hours, 24 hours, whatever it is. During that time, you allow your body to burn stored food energy. Hey, why does it need to change from 2000? So this is the difference between calorie restriction of 1200 calories and eating one time, or 1200 calories in one day, is that you're taking 1200 calories, for example, from food and 800 calories from body fat, because you've dropped your insulin and allowed your body to access that body fat. Now your body's like, yeah, I'm going to burn 2000 because I want to. Whereas before, when your insulin is high, you've blocked it off and you can only burn 1200. And that's the difference between sort of intermittent fasting and just calorie restriction. And you can see why one works and one doesn't work. You're simply allowing your body to access the stored food energy that's on your body. And guess what? That's what it's there for. That's what body fat is there for. It's not there for looks. It's there for you to use.
Oh, that's so brilliant. I really want to dive more into insulin. I think that's a great analogy. And it really underscoring the importance of the hormonal balance. And speaking of hormones, ghrelin is a hormone people talk about, and the context of like why women shouldn't fast. And there was a study that came out that showed that ghrelin reduction was actually better in women versus men, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, that was a fascinating study. So they talk about why women shouldn't fast, and I honestly, I don't know why people say that. It doesn't really make any sense. I mean, if a woman is underweight or at risk of anorexia, sure, that makes sense. Like, you gotta apply everything in a clinical context. You're not gonna put a 16-year-old, 80-pound girl on some kind of fasting diet. You're asking for trouble. They might get anorexia nervosa, sure. But you put a 250-pound, 60-year-old man on fasting, he's not going to get anorexia nervosa, okay? So women can fast, absolutely. And ghrelin is the so-called hunger hormone, so the higher it is, the hungrier you are. And when they looked at food craving, so one of the things that we talk about all the time is people, when they come in, the number one sort of concern about fasting is hunger. They think, I can't do it, I'm going to get so hungry. And what you have to realize is that when you look at ghrelin, over 24 hours, if you don't eat over 24 hours, you see ghrelin spike, and it spikes 3 times, at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So we're trained to eat, a lot of people are trained to eat 3 times a day. So when it comes around to noontime, ghrelin spikes up. But the key is that it doesn't continue to go up. If you don't eat, it actually just drops back down to normal. And anybody who's worked through dinner or worked through lunch knows this, because at 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, you're hungry. But then you're so busy, you're just working, you're working. By 4 o'clock, it's as if you ate. There's actually no difference in hunger if you ate or you didn't eat. Why is that? Well, because insulin fell, your body essentially ate lunch out of your own body fat. It's like, okay, that's perfect. That's exactly what we want it to do. But the hunger does not keep going up. It comes in waves, and we say you got to ride those waves out, because they will come. It'll be dinner time, you're going to get hungry. But if you ride it out, it's going to go down. So if you look at food cravings, you see the same thing. So you can do these questionnaires, and this study looked at food cravings. And they compared a sort of standard calorie restriction diet to a sort of ultra low calorie diet, like a couple hundred calories a day sort of thing. And what they found was that the cravings essentially disappeared. And women versus men had much higher levels of these ghrelin spikes. And it sort of makes sense when you talk about people who are chocoholics and crave these foods. It's women for more than men, these sugar cravings and all that. And physiologically, you see that the women have these much higher ghrelin spikes, and they come right down when you fast them. So again, if you have cravings, the important thing is not to say, well, I'm going to eat a little bit, because it's like an itch. If you're a parent, you know that you don't touch that itch. If you scratch it, it's going to get worse. It's the same thing with cravings. You don't say, okay, I'm going to take a little bit, because it's going to get worse. If you take those cravings for, and it applies to everything, so you have a craving for sweets, if you all of a sudden stop eating sweets entirely, those cravings actually disappear. So fasting is much more powerful, because if you have cravings for bread, and then you just stop eating bread, those cravings will actually diminish. Whereas if you just eat, oh, I'm just going to eat a little bit of bread all the time.
Or gluten-free bread.
Yeah, that's right.
Low-carb bread.
That will not go away.
Yeah.
It does not go away, even if you reduce the amount of bread that you eat or sweets that you eat, because you have to take those sort of cravings down to a zero level, take the food down to the zero level, and then the cravings disappear. And that's the real power of the intermittent fasting, and also the ketogenic diets, for example. So if you're eating ultra low carb, well, after a while, you simply get used to it, and those cravings for the carbs go away. And that's one of the sort of keys to a lot of people's success, is that once they stop eating it, they find that they don't have to eat it. But if you eat it sometimes, you're going to get those cravings right back. They come right back. And sort of knowing this is important, because then you can say, well, you can now use this information to your advantage, because if you know you have this sort of addictive behavior and so on, you can use these to get rid of your cravings. At the same time, do something which is very healthy and has all these other benefits in terms of protein breakdown and autophagy and all these other things. And that's the real key, is having that knowledge allows you to sort of say, okay, well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And this is getting back to what I was saying, is that to me, weight loss is really about sort of two things: what you eat and when you eat. And sort of we talk endlessly about the what to eat, but the when to eat is sort of completely ignored. So if you ignore sort of like this huge sort of 50 or 60% of the problem, you're going to fail, because you're not addressing it. Because we've gone from eating sort of 3 times a day to somewhere around 6 to 10 times a day. And we think it's good for you, right? You see this all the time. And the question is, where did this advice that you have to eat all the time come from?
Food industry, fitness industry, something, yeah.
It sure didn't come from the doctors, because no doctor I know has ever found any study that proves that eating 6 or 8 times a day is good for you. And nobody in the history of humanity has ever done that, because we had work to do. You have to go out in the fields. You have to go, plow the fields. You're not spending all your time eating. And yet we think that we shouldn't go more than a couple of hours without stuffing cookies in our mouths. And we teach our children this. You should look at my son's schedule. I mean, not anymore, but when they were in like grade school and so on. Eat breakfast. In the middle of the morning, a couple of cookies or something. Lunch, after school, some,
Treats,
fruit or something. Dinner, and then you go to soccer, and in between the halves, another granola bar. And like, come on. I used to go out and play after dinner, and it's like, you didn't eat. You're busy playing. You didn't need to stop to eat, and so you didn't eat anything from dinner until at least breakfast the next day, if you ate breakfast.
Yeah, I deal with that with my daughter right now, and it seems that there's always a birthday party, some special event, and it's always sugar-based foods. Anyway, topic for another conversation, but I think it's really kind of fascinating about the ladies, that ghrelin spike and so forth, and going back to that, just completely my problem with diet foods is there's the paleo donuts, the low carb donuts. All this stuff is emerging for people, and like you said, they just need to kick the habit. obviously we need to enjoy life too and have a little food periodically, but no one would ever advise a heroin addict just take a small little hit. You're gonna be okay with just a small hit. It's like they have to go cold turkey, so that's kind of an interesting.
Yeah, and again, the key is understanding that there's a difference between the sort of carbohydrate insulin hypothesis and the insulin hypothesis. So the insulin hypothesis says that insulin is one of the key regulators of body weight, which I think is true. What's not true is that carbs are the only sort of input into that system. And that's where a lot of people get into these debates, because it's like, can you eat high carb foods and still have low insulin? Absolutely. So you go back to the Okinawans, for example, they're eating 65% sweet potato diets. There's no obesity whatsoever. You go to the Kitavans, they're eating sort of 65-70% carbohydrates. Their serum insulin levels are like 5 percentile compared to a Swedish population, no obesity. Well, why is that? Well, a big part of it is that you're not eating all the time. So even though you're eating cassava and root vegetables and all this, and you got to remember again, in the 1980s in China, all white rice and vegetables, but you're not eating 10 times a day. There's like almost no sugar in that diet. There's a lot of carbohydrates. So you can look at the Chinese, and some people say, oh, they're eating brown rice. They're not eating brown rice. Like I have relatives from there. Everybody's eating white rice. It's all refined grains. But they're not eating all the time. They're eating very little sugar, like almost zero sugar. And I think, for different reasons, sugar is much, much, much more fattening than any other carbohydrate out there. And this is even though you get no insulin effect of fructose. So fructose has no insulin effect. It has no glycemic index effect. So people used to think it's great, but it's actually very, very bad for you. And I think it's sort of like 20 times as fattening as, say, bread, which is sort of glucose as opposed to the fructose. So there's no sugar in that. They're not eating all the time. There's no, there's all these other sort of mitigating factors that keep their insulin low. So you can eat a low-fat diet, you can eat a high-fat diet and still keep your insulin low. And we see this in traditional societies all over the world. There are societies that are based on eating meat, and they do fine. And there's societies that are based on eating white rice, like China, and they're doing fine, obesity-wise, obesity and type 2 diabetes. But yet they're widely varying in terms of their macronutrients. So I actually never tell people to eat, to watch the macronutrient. I don't think it's that important. But you have to always keep in mind the insulin effect. And a huge part of that is sort of frequency of eating and getting that way down. So if 3 per day is sort of what people have traditionally done and done fairly well with that, well, that's pretty good. But if you've been eating 10 a day for the last 10 years, going back to 3 a day is not going to cut it. You're not going to lose weight like that. You got to go lower than 3 to make up for those sort of 10 years of 10 a day. And just like the and this is where the calories thing and the insulin thing really overlaps, because again, anything you eat, assuming it's a blend of the 3 macronutrients, is going to stimulate insulin to some effect. And it's going to have some calories. So there's going to be an overlap between calories and insulin effect. So that's where the confusion comes in, because people say, oh, it's all about calories. Like, it's not about calories. There's nothing to do with calories, but there's an overlap between the two. But when you look at insulin, what you say is that 100 calories of certain foods are more fattening than 100 calories of other foods, which is sort of common sense and what your grandmother sort of would have told you. Like, she's not going to say, oh, eat cookies for dinner. And I've seen this advice given out by doctors. Oh, if you want cookies and ice cream, eat it instead of dinner and you'll be fine. I'm like, oh God, you guys have no clue. Because again, you ignore that physiology. I mean, there's a whole thing to do with satiety, for example. Remember that as you eat foods, you're going to activate certain satiety signals. So if you go to the buffet and you eat like a lot, like way too much, and then you try and eat a couple more pork chops, it's like you'll never do it. You can't do it. You can't force that pork chop down. But if you're to eat some cookie, you could easily do that.
Everyone has room for cookie ice cream.
Exactly. Because there's no satiety effect of those highly refined grains, the sugar, the fructose. You're going to get the calories, you're going to get the insulin effect, but you're not going to get any sort of satiety effect.
Yeah.
That's why I used to think it's very strange, because you can eat lunch, and this I used to think this as a kid actually. It's very strange that you can eat lunch, or you can eat lunch with a big soda, and you'll feel exactly the same in terms of fullness. But you've taken a lot more calories when you drink that big soda. It's like, I wonder why. You'd think, oh, for 2,000 calories, I should feel the same amount of full. No, it's completely different. And this is the thing with natural foods, is that they have natural satiety mechanisms. So if you eat a lot of beans, which is all carbohydrates, while you'll stretch your stomach, you'll activate stretch receptors. If you eat a lot of steak, you're going to activate peptide YY, which is for protein. You're going to activate incretins, which is for another satiety signal. You're going to activate cholecystokinin, which is a satiety signal. You're going to activate the vagus nerve, also in terms of stretch receptors. So you can eat something which is very bulky and feel full, or you can eat something that's very not bulky and feel full, because we have natural satiety mechanisms, and this is part of human physiology, because our we don't want to die. Like, we don't want to stuff ourselves so much. Like, you hear these arguments that, we're genetically programmed to get fat. We just eat everything in front of our face. It's like, you try eating that 60-ounce steak that you'll get for free if you eat it in an hour.
Yeah.
They're not going out of business anytime soon, because there's powerful satiety mechanisms. What processing does is it removes all that. So you take flour. So if you're to eat carbohydrates like beans, you're going to get full. Even rice, you're going to get full, but not as full as you might think. But now you take flour, you take out all the fat, so you take out all the protein, because the fat goes rancid, so you don't want it to go rancid, so you take out all the fat, you take out all the protein, you cut down a lot of the bulk of the fiber. Well, you've just lost 3 satiety signals. You've lost the stretch receptors in the stomach, you've lost the protein satiety signals, and you've lost the fat satiety signals. Then you grind it into a fine powder, because flour, when you throw it up, is very fine. You grind it into a fine powder that it gets absorbed super fast. So just like cocaine, the reason people grind it up is so that they can get that massive high. So now you grind it up, you get this massive high when you're eating your white bread. Now, okay, so it's fine for a bit, and then 2 hours later, it crashes because you've just gone spiked up and spiked down, and then you want to eat a muffin because you had that bagel in the morning and it's all gone now because it's gone up and down. So that's where the processing is completely different. As opposed to, say, even like a potato. If you eat a baked potato, it's pretty filling. Like,
hard to overeat that.
Yeah, it's pretty hard. I mean, when you process it, when you do things like potato chips and stuff and add flavorings and stuff, deep frying, it changes things.
Yeah.
But it's pretty difficult to eat to overeat a boiled potato. Like, people have gone on these potato diets, and I eat potatoes sometimes. It's pretty filling. Like, that's why this whole meat and potatoes, sort of thing is, because the potato is actually one of the highest foods on the satiety index. So if you eat a potato calorie for calorie, you will feel more full than virtually anything else. It's hard to overeat boiled potatoes.
Yeah.
Baked potatoes is kind of similar. It's pretty hard to overeat that. But again, you're activating natural satiety mechanisms. Like, the potato's pretty big. It's going to fill up. It's going to activate these other stretch receptors. It's almost all starch, so there's very little fat, very little protein. But it's going to activate other things. So the Irish, for example, ate tons of potatoes. Didn't have much of a problem until recently, until the 70s, just like everybody else. So there's a lot of things. So yes, there's carbohydrates, but what's really important is the insulin, because you can eat a sort of low-fat diet, high in carbohydrates, and still have low insulin levels and still have very little obesity. And that was what came out in the Diet Fit study. So this is that study that Chris Gardner did a couple of weeks ago, I guess it got released, and what it showed was that if you take people and put them on a low-fat diet and a low-carb diet, they did roughly equally, but it wasn't just any kind of low fat diet. It's not like white bread and jam sort
Yeah.
of thing. It was all unprocessed foods. It was all, and you see that he actually had a period of time that you weren't supposed to eat all the time.
Yeah.
And
They were encouraged to go to farmers markets.
Yeah, exactly. There's a whole lot of stuff in there. It wasn't like go out and eat some, some pasta and white bread.
Yeah.
It was this sort of healthy, sort of eat lots of vegetables, and there was a whole lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at that study and I was thinking that's exactly what we tell people. Unprocessed foods, because it's not simply about the carbohydrates. We have to move past that. You have to get into this sort of insulin, because that's the sort of language the body speaks. If you're speaking about carbs and proteins and stuff, that's not really, it's closer to, but it's not exactly the language that the body understands. The body responds to signals, which are hormones. So you want to get your insulin high, the body's going to gain weight. Well, you could eat a low-fat diet, you could eat a low-carb diet, and still have the same effect on insulin. So that's where I differ from some of the people in terms of the carb insulin hypothesis. You could eat a high protein diet, for example, all meat diet. You could do all of these things and still get the same effect of low insulin and therefore less obesity, less type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
And that's where understanding the sort of physiology gets you around all these debates and tries to understand why people can eat different diets and still do well, and that's what I try and bring out in the books is sort of the science and the understanding to do it.
Yeah, great. I have two examples of that. Definitely want to dive into insulin, especially I didn't know it was discovered here in Toronto.
Yeah,
super fascinating. But you mentioned the satiety signals that whole foods garner on the body, and they're kind of lost in the processing of food. And one example of a remedy that you talk about, I personally am very interested in this as well. I've been studying it for a while. Is gastric bypass or bariatric surgery, and the hormonal. I'm not a fan of the procedure saying that it's good for weight loss, but admiring the mechanism of action through which gastric or bariatric surgery affects insulin resistance is really interesting. You take a full-blown insulin-dependent type 2 diabetic, as you know, 12 hours after the procedure, they don't need insulin because the gut hormones that you mentioned are upregulated with whole real food are super physiologically upregulated. So.
Yeah, bariatric surgery is fascinating because it's quite successful, and people used to say, well, why does it work? Maybe it's because you cut out a big swath of the stomach, right? You come out like 90% of the stomach, and therefore you can't produce certain hormones. Well, the problem with that is that you can do gastric banding, where you put a sort of belt around the stomach and cinch it really tight, and you'll get the same effect. So since you're not cutting out any part of the stomach, then the benefits cannot be from cutting out the stomach. And the truth is that the effect is simply a severe caloric restriction. You're basically putting them very close to fasting as much as you possibly can for months at a time. I mean, they're eating so little that you might as well be fasting. So fasting, the whole point is to get your insulin down. Now you're not eating, you can't eat because they've cut out all your stomach and they've rewired your intestines so that even if you eat food, it's not getting absorbed. Well, what's going to happen? Well, insulin's going to drop and it's going to keep dropping. So what's going to happen is that your body is going to burn off all that sugar. Burn off the sugar, diabetes goes away. Then as it burns off all that sugar, then it's going to burn all that fat. And guess what? The weight loss is very, very good. Yeah. So the mechanism is quite easy to understand once you understand that it's really about changing the insulin, which is the main hormone. It's not the only hormone that's responsible for weight gain. Cortisol is another one. But for the most part, it's about insulin. So that once you understand that, you can see this is why bariatrics is so effective. And sometimes you say, well, this is really just medical bariatrics. All these fasting therapies is just medical bariatrics. But it's not easy. It's not fun. And that's really one of the things that we try to do. So we have a program for this, which is the Intensive Dietary Management Program. And people can join, and we have sort of, so the website is idmprogram.com. And if, we put out a lot of stuff for free, like these sort of videos, and we do podcasts and I do weekly blog posts, and there's lots of free stuff. And if people can just get the information, and there's the books that are very inexpensive, or you can take it from the library. So there's a lot of information out there, but sometimes people want a little bit more guidance. So what we've done is we've provided sort of a little bit more guidance, question and answers, group fast, because again, it's about building this community of people who will help each other. And that's one of the secrets of any kind of behavior change, is that you do better in a group. So whether you're looking at Weight Watchers or Alcoholics Anonymous, the point is that changing behaviors is difficult to do, and if you have people who will support you, your success rate is going to be much, much higher. So we're trying to put together a community in our membership program that people can join for a fee and then get the guidance from sort of trained professionals that they need. They get the sort of extra help that they need to do it. If you can do it on your own, great, but most people, they get out there, they start fasting, and then some doctor tells them, oh God, you're going to kill yourself, and then they're done. And then it's like, oh, but you know, you could have gained so much with it. And then we also have sort of an additional program where people will provide sort of small groups, sort of in groups of 3 or 4. Of course, anytime you do that, it's much more expensive because you're getting sort of personalized care. But at least it's available for you. So we try and provide sort of everything from the free stuff to the books and the podcasts and the stuff we're doing here. So that. I hope people can just listen and do it themselves. But hey, if you need some help, we're also here. We can give you more help if you need it. The membership site is $39 a month, I think, and it's like we do these group fasts, which are very popular, so that people fast all together for 3 or 4 days. And it's not necessarily you do the full 4 days. Maybe you do a 24-hour fast for 3 days, or, for example. But because you're doing it with a group of sort of supportive people, it's easier, and then you get the benefit. And in school, we understand this. We call it peer pressure, and it's got a negative connotation. As adults, it's called peer support, because it's like we're trying to change behavior, and you're joining a group to get the support that you need. And guess what? It's like very, very important. It's actually like, it sounds like it's one of these kind of throwaway things, but it's actually, as we started doing our program, we've been doing it for about 5 years now. That was one of the sort of keys to success, was getting people into the small groups and into the bigger groups, where people can talk about fasting without getting laughed at, essentially. And that's been very important. And then I realized, of course, that's the whole secret of Weight Watchers, sort of the biggest Oprah-led company now. But their diet's nothing special. It's a decent enough diet, but you could have gotten that diet anywhere.
Right.
You could have gone to any book and gotten that diet. The secret sauce was the peer support. Alcoholics Anonymous, again, peer support, being out there. And we're fighting such a big fight because the conventional dietary advice is to eat sort of 8-10 times a day, eat these low-fat foods. So we're sort of swimming upstream in terms of our advice, because we generally advise people to eat sort of whole, unprocessed, real foods, often low carbs, but not necessarily, and then intermittent fasting, whether it's less than a day or more than a day. And that's where it gets people's kind of goat up, is that the intermittent fasting really scares a lot of these people, and then they get scared out of it right away. They don't have that peer support. So we're trying to build that into our program, and if that's what you need, we're hopefully providing it at a fairly reasonable price. That people, I mean, if you're skipping a meal, I mean that's like the cost of 1 year, right? It's like okay, you're gonna come out ahead if you do this.
Totally, that's awesome. IDMprogram.com. Right?
IDMprogram.
Okay, I'll put that in the show notes and below this video, and then let's kind of finish up on the book a little bit. A few things, a few that I remember, like they're inked in my head. You can't fix a dietary disease with medicine. I might botch that a little bit, but I think that's really important, because a lot of people don't realize that traditional medical system, like the solution in for a lot of traditionally trained practitioners, is insulin, more and more insulin. And what happens when you get more and more insulin?
Yeah, the problem is that type 2 diabetes is a really misunderstood disease by the doctors. Then what they don't understand is that they're treating sort of the blood glucose. So the blood glucose or blood sugar is high, so they try and get it down. If you give insulin, well, does that get rid of the sugar? And the answer is no. the insulin takes that sugar and simply crams it into your liver. Okay, and then the liver turns it into fat through de novo lipogenesis or sends that sugar everywhere else. And so the sugar goes into your eyes, into your liver, into your nerves, into your legs, into your heart. And what happens? Well, what happens over decades is that as you keep cramming the sugar from thy blood, you had excess sugar in the blood, you never got rid of it, but you took insulin to cram it into your body sort of just blows up with way too much sugar. And then every part of your anatomy just rots. So you go blind, and you get heart attacks, and you get strokes, and you get nerve damage, and you get amputations, you get diabetic foot infections. And it's like, why do diabetics get infections that nobody else in the whole world gets? Why? Because there's sugar. There's so much sugar sitting around in that foot that you get infections like yeast infections that love the sugar. Mm-hmm. And it's crazy because what it means is that type 2 diabetes is essentially being treated completely incorrectly. We're treating the blood glucose. So we know the blood glucose is high because of the type 2 diabetes. But the blood glucose is not the disease, it's the symptom. So if you treat the symptom but don't treat the disease, then you're not going to get anywhere. It's symptomatic treatment. And that's the real problem. We're treating the symptom and pretending like that's the real disease. So yes, we got the blood glucose down. Have you treated the type 2 diabetes with your insulin? And the answer is no. Well, everybody knows that if you lose weight, your diabetes gets better. So insulin makes you gain weight. So
right.
Your diabetes is not getting better, it's getting worse. And the whole point is that you simply can't take the sugar in your blood and cram it away where you can't see it and pretend you're better. You got to get rid of that sugar. So in essence, the simplest way to understand type 2 diabetes is that there's just too much sugar in the body. The body is overfilled with sugar. Well, if it's overfilled with sugar, then you just got to get rid of the sugar. What do? One, don't put more sugar in. Eat a low carbohydrate diet. And number two, burn it all off. And that's intermittent fasting. Mm-hmm. So what we've done is we've taken this dietary disease, and instead of treating the root cause of it, which is the diet, we're eating too much carbohydrates predominantly because we were told to, and we're eating too many times, too frequently. But what we've done is instead of treating the actual cause of it, we tried to drug it. We're trying to drug these people back to health. And we're not treating what was the actual problem in the first place. And then we wonder, why is everybody getting worse? And the worst part is that the answer that most specialists, researchers give is that type 2 diabetes is just like that. It's a chronic and progressive disease. It's like, no, it's chronic and progressive because you treated it completely wrong. The disease is actually reversible. We know that. Anybody who loses weight, their diabetes reverses. We know that from bariatrics. You can take the most severe type 2 diabetic and within 2 weeks, they'll be off of all their insulin, for example, because they're basically burning it all off because they're fasting. And it's not really hard to understand. If you don't eat, you're going to burn off that sugar. Your blood sugar will drop. If your blood sugar drops, you don't need to take insulin. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not so hard to understand. But now you're dealing with the actual problem of sugar overload as opposed to trying to give more insulin. So here we have a situation which is sort of mind-boggling, that 99% of diabetics, type 2 diabetics in this country, in this world, are actually being treated, I think, completely incorrectly. And that's why, since everybody's getting worse, the doctors say, well, it's chronic and progressive because I gave them insulin and they got worse. So therefore, the disease must be like that. Yet at the same time knowing that this disease cannot possibly be like that because we just proved it with our bariatric surgery. That we could take this guy, do something to him, which is basically fast him for like 3 months, and make him completely better. Everybody who has type 2 diabetes is reversible except up until the very late stage. That's a fact that we've sort of proven with our bariatric surgery. And it's a fact that we already knew, because we know that if your friend loses 50 pounds, he's going to get off his diabetic medication. No doctor is going to say, oh, I wonder why that happened. It's like, well, obviously, right? But so we know this for a fact that it's a reversible disease, yet we pretend it's chronic and progressive because we've been doing such a bad job because we've been using the wrong treatment.
Interesting. When in your career, so you've been practicing medicine for over 20 years, right?
About 20 years, yeah.
And you talk about in the book, like, I know how to make people fat. You know, you're insulin resistant, give them insulin. At what point did you see enough patients gain more and more weight when you were following the standard of care that you said, this can't be right?
Well, it took a long time.
Yeah.
Dogma's very hard to break. And interestingly, it was the patients who all knew. They're all like, you know, you gave me insulin. I'm gaining weight like crazy here. Like, how is that good?
Yeah.
And the answer is it wasn't good. But I didn't know the answer, so I said, well, you know, it's just the way it is. I mean, that's what I said. That's what everybody else said too. But at some point, I mean, it was 2008, 2009 that we started getting some of the data that really showed that giving insulin is not a good idea to type 2 diabetics, which, when you look back at it, is completely sort of rational. That is, we know in type 2 diabetes that insulin levels are high. So why are you giving more insulin?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that like giving alcohol to an alcoholic? How do you think they're going to get better? If you give alcohol to an alcoholic, their shaking might get better, but their alcoholism, which is the actual disease, gets worse. So it's the same thing. You give insulin to somebody who has too much insulin, the blood sugar gets better, but the diabetes gets worse. And that's what we've been doing. We've been treating these addicts with heroin. It's like, oh my God. And what's scary is that people are still doing it today,
It's
right
crazy.
now, and pretending it's the right treatment. It's like, oh, okay, well, that's not a good idea. And it's like, no wonder everybody's getting worse. No wonder the health of the nation is getting worse, because we've sort of focused on the wrong sort of quadrant, which is we think it's a drug problem, but it's a diet problem. We took type 1 diabetes, which is where insulin's very low. So if insulin's very low, then give insulin. That's a good treatment. If insulin's very high, don't give insulin. That's not a good treatment.
Yeah, you're not, as you said, not solving the root cause of the problem. It's not an insulin deficiency syndrome as type 1 diabetes is.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a receptor. Gosh, we could go on and talk all about this stuff. I really want to commend you for all your great work. Both the books. The Obesity Code really changed my mind on a lot of different things, particularly that the time, the latency, how long someone has been overweight, that it's going to affect their weight loss. And I think that's something that people really need to think about, you know, because they see the lean person get shredded for spring break and they're like, well, I want to do that, but they've been overweight for 35 years. So we need to be realistic.
Yeah, and that calorie theory simply can't explain that, because the calorie theory would say that if you've been overweight for 10 years or 10 days, it's the same.
Yeah.
You create that caloric deficit and you're both going to lose weight.
Yeah.
And everybody knows that's not going to happen.
Right.
And yet we pretend that, oh yeah, of course, it's all about calories. It's like, what are you? Like, do you live in the real world? Like, do you actually treat people? Because everybody knows that that guy who's been overweight for 30 years, those pounds ain't coming off.
Yeah.
Like in 10 days. Like the 20-year-old who gained a few pounds from a few beers at spring break, right? So yeah, absolutely. That's the key to understanding. And the physiology's all been there, but it's been sort of distorted by all of this sort of other interests, like particularly food companies, for example, sugary beverage companies, who want the calorie theory to be correct. And this is one of the things that we're really looking to get into, is sort of advocacy to get the sort of conflicts of interest out of medicine. Having been in medicine, I realized that there's actually all these problems. Like, there's not just pharmaceuticals, but the research. So we all pretend we live in this world of evidence-based medicine. The problem is, if all the evidence is corrupt, then evidence-based medicine is also going to be corrupt. So if all your evidence is produced by pharmaceuticals, is produced by people getting paid by the sugar industry, for example, well, you're going to think sugar is fine. And we have studies that prove that funded studies, so if you fund a study, then you're like something like 6 to 10 times more likely to find a result favoring your sponsor. Well, that's just human nature. So we have a guy in Toronto, a Dr. Stephen Piper, who is out there all the time saying sugar's good, fructose is good, it's like a health food. I'm like, okay, that's really dumb. That's what I'm thinking. And then, of course, in the newspaper, in the National Post last year, which is our national newspaper, it's like, oh yeah, he takes hundreds of thousands of dollars from the sugar industry, Coca-Cola and everybody. I'm like, okay.
Makes sense.
Well, this makes total sense. And here's the sugar industry funding the University of Toronto, which is happily taking all this cash, they're taking all this money, and producing shoddy research. And it's like, I don't blame the sugar company. The sugar company, or the pharmaceutical, or the big food company, I don't blame them at all. Because their responsibility is to sell sugary beverage. That's their responsibility to their company, to their shareholders. That's their whole goal.
Yeah.
It's out there. Coke is there to sell Coke. That's its job. The problem is that we allow Coke to pay the University of Toronto millions of dollars to produce crappy research. Why do we allow that? If you give a New York City policeman a cold drink, he could get fired because it's a conflict of interest. If you give a judge sort of a slice of pizza, he or she could get fired for taking that slice of pizza. And we all say, of course, you can't bribe a judge, whether it's a slice of pizza or a car. It's the same principle.
The reciprocity.
Exactly. Because when I give you something, you're going to feel better towards me. That's all human nature. So we say, okay, I understand this. Everybody understands this. So therefore, nobody is allowed to give policemen, nobody's allowed to give judges anything. But we say, oh yeah, but if you're a big company, you can give doctors however much money you want. So you look at a journal like the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, and the editors, which decide which journals get published, what everything is, on average, they're taking each over $400,000 a year from companies. And it's like, okay, I don't blame the company. The company, if it means selling more stuff, that's what they should be doing. The question is, why do we allow that to happen when it doesn't apply to anybody else? You can't give $400,000 to a New York Times journalist. They will get fired by the New York Times. They will absolutely get fired. You can't go to some company, all big companies have this rule. I can't go to the bank manager and say, oh, hey, here's $10,000, you're gonna give me a loan, right? He's gonna get fired or she's gonna get fired. Everywhere we know this, we put rules on it, but yet, when it comes to our health, we say, hey, Dr. Stephen Piper, you can here's $500,000. Just do some research on why sugar is good for you. And he produces it, and then people come out and say, well, the evidence says that sugar is good for us. It's like, isn't that the most ridiculous situation you've ever heard? This is one of the things that really has to get out there, because if you have differences of opinion between scientists, that's fine. That's how science works. Everybody has a different opinion. I don't mind that. So the vegans have a different opinion than I do. That's fine. The problem is when you get all these sort of commercial interests in it. But it's not a problem for the commercial interests. I mean, the drug companies, they're allowed to do it, so they should do it, and they will do it, because that's what their stated goal is. Their stated goal is to sell more drug.
Right.
What we have to do is we have to be on our, political, we have to get political and really say, okay, we shouldn't be allowing any of this. Anybody who teaches students, medical students, teaches at the university, is not allowed to take money. Like,
seems like a no-brainer.
That's like a no-brainer.
Yeah.
They take hundreds of thousands of dollars, every single one of them.
Wow.
These programs, like the pharmaceuticals put out, they pay a doctor $1,500 to give an hour-long talk. Lots of doctors do it. The more prominent, the more money they get. They pay editors of large journals like hundreds of thousands of dollars each to get their research into it. the studies are all produced by drug companies, and we know that if that's the case, then it's far more likely to be biased. And the whole thing. And people complain about, oh, you know, it's big sugar and big tobacco and big meat. It's like, that's the first thing we should be doing, is saying we need new rules. Nobody's allowed to pay university professors any kind of money. You want to be a university professor, you want the privilege of teaching medical students, you get paid by the university. You don't get paid by anybody else. If you want to write guidelines, clinical guidelines for diabetes, clinical guidelines for dietary guidelines, whatever it is, anybody who writes any kind of guideline is not allowed to take money from anybody. Because doctors are the worst, because they take lots of money from everybody, and they think that just disclosing it is fine. It's like, I don't care if you say it, don't do it. You don't have a judge out there saying, oh yeah, I've been paid by this, and that. So you go to these lectures, and they're terrible because we have financial disclosure slides, and so anytime you go to any lecture, somebody will flash up a slide, and there's like 15 drug companies on it that he's been paid by. And he goes, and he'll always say something like, I'm not biased because I'm paid by everybody. And everybody laughs. I'm thinking, oh my God.
Yeah.
You guys don't even know how crooked the whole situation is, because in any other sphere of life, it would be completely unacceptable. Would it be acceptable for your child's teacher to be getting money from
Who knows
Coca-Cola?
what? Yeah. No, I agree.
Absolutely not.
Right.
Absolutely 100% not. You would never stand for it. I would never stand for it. If I knew my teacher, my child's teacher, was being paid by Coke, and hey, teaches them that Coke is okay. But yet, Coke can pay Dr. Stephen Piper lots of money to come out and say, hey, sugar's good for you. Then he teaches the medical students, hey, sugar's good for you. Which teaches you that sugar is good for you. And then you get diabetes and die. It's like, that's very wrong. There's something very wrong there. And that's one of the things that we really have to get the rules changed. Not because they're stricter than anybody else. We need the same rules as everybody else. And the health of the sort of whole nation sort of depends on it. We have so many of these researchers that are just on the payroll. It's like, oh,
publishing biased. So it's kind of a parting note here. How do you look at research then now to try and look at it more objectively with the idea that this could be funded in a different way?
Yeah, it's really hard. That's why most people who have understand evidence-based medicine think it's completely crap. So there's guys like there's a former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet. These are the two sort of most prominent medical journals in the world, who have both said, yeah, after like 20 years of being in the business, I realized that it's all crap.
Yeah.
Most of what we publish is not true. There's this replication bias, where people try and juice up their findings so that it gets in the newspapers, and then when they try and replicate the study, it's like, oh, it wasn't true at all. They only got the result because they were trying to find a result to get in the newspaper, sort of thing. So anybody who actually understands evidence-based medicine, so these are the sort of the editors-in-chief, the guys who have been there and done that and lived that life. They've all basically turned their back and said it's all just crap now. And it's not that the idea is bad. It's a good idea. But what you have to do is say, get all the commercial interests out of science. You can't have a drug company doing a study on their own drug and saying, this is the best thing since sliced bread. Everybody should do it, and anybody who doesn't do it is some Luddite who doesn't understand evidence-based medicine. It's like, okay, but there's something really wrong here. If the heroin company is saying, look at this study. Heroin benefits
Not that
everybody.
bad,
and came out and taught the doctors and gave doctors hundreds of thousands of dollars to teach medical students that heroin's good for you. We'd say, buddy, that study was funded by the heroin company. You can't trust it. But when we say, oh, that study was funded by the drug company, we're like, yay. It's like logic is just like, I'm like kind of appalled sort of with how everything is developed in medicine, in that logic seems to sort of play no role in what we do. That is, you can't allow drug companies to do their own study and then tout their own horn and then dictate how we do medicine.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Like, you've given it up. And why? Because our leaders, our university professors, are all on the payroll.
It's crazy. Yeah, it's a great book about biases, Decisive, by the Heath brothers, Dan and Chip Heath.
Oh, okay.
And so I just noticed that I, as someone who's benefited, been the beneficiary of fasting and the ketogenic diet, I'm very biased pro that. But now when I read research, I try and really be aware of that, because you find yourself seeking out more of the same.
Yeah.
And so human nature, we're very, very biased creatures. So you can see how this could happen. But if in terms of like kind of a parting piece of advice, like the biggest health issue, do you think that's one of them, that so-called evidence-based medicine is really industry funded? And
yeah, I think that there's sort of a couple of things. I mean, there's from a health standpoint, honestly, it's metabolic syndrome, obesity, type 2 diabetes. That's clearly going to be the issue of our times.
yeah.
It's killing tons of people. Cardiovascular disease, stroke, cancer. Those are the biggest sort of 3 killers of Americans, and they're all sort of metabolic problems. So that's sort of the biggest problem, and going to the sort of standard medical dogma is not great for the related issue of a lot of bias in medicine research. The good news is that you can take control of your own health, through understanding like what we're talking about, do the cutting out processed foods, reducing the number of times that you eat, intermittent fasting, and sort of regain sort of 90% of your health. So from the good news from a patient perspective is that yes, you can do something about it right now. The larger societal issue is exactly that, to get the bias out of medical science, because the reason that medical science is hopelessly bad is that there's just too much bias. So if you look back at the 1970s, obesity goes from very little to very high. So we're worse than we were in 1970.
Yeah.
If you look at technology, a 1970s computer is like the size of this room. It has like, a tenth of the computing power of my iPhone. It's like, that's the power of human ingenuity. In nutrition, we've gone backwards. We would have gone from a computer the size of this room to a computer the size of this entire complex.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. And it's because there's too much bias. We get people saying that sugar is good for you. I mean, tobacco is the same thing. For years, people said, no problem, no problem. Why? They're all on the payroll. Okay, so we understand that for tobacco. Why don't we understand it for drug companies, for this and that? And again, it's not that I'm anti-drug companies. Drug companies have a very valuable role, but they need to be sort of over there, and the university has to be over here, and you have to split them. And if their drug is good, then the university will say, okay, well, your drug is good. But at least I know that you're not paying the guy who's saying it's good.
Yeah.
Again, it's pure common sense, and it's like we just have to change that to move forward. So that's sort of the larger, I think that in the end, that's the larger societal issue. The individual issue that's the biggest, that's going to impact everybody, is going to be, how to apply the proper standards of nutrition, intermittent fasting. I think that part has been missing for so long. And really, until I started talking about it, I don't think anybody was talking about fasting, truthfully.
No.
Not in terms of health. They're bodybuilders and stuff,
Yeah.
but not in terms of treatment of disease and that kind of thing. That part is the biggest part for the individual patient, but they can actually do something about it. And that's what I hope to do with the
Yeah.
books, with the
Right.
IDM program, and with the blog, and with the podcast, and your podcast, and all that sort of stuff. That's
Sure.
what we try to do. We try to empower people to sort of take control, because it's like, if you watch this and you decide to do it and get better, hey, I don't get paid. But guess what? If you write to me and say, you know what, I watched your thing with Mike and I lost 50 pounds and I got rid of my diabetes, I'm paid in a totally different way.
Yeah.
That's much more valuable than the money.
Than a little money,
because it's
totally.
like, oh, we were able to help these people.
Feels
you know,
great.
Feels great.
better
No
to
amount of
give.
money is going to get that for you.
Yeah,
Right? And that's
love
the point. That's the point, is that people can do that, and that's
Yeah.
the hope.
And the book is great. You know, it goes through the historical role that fasting has had in humankind and as a medical therapy. I think back to 1770 something, or long time ago. So yeah, the book's awesome. It's available as you guys watch this video. It should be available on Amazon for pre-orders worldwide. So commend you on all that great stuff. idmprogram.com if people want to get into the membership site and get into that group setting, which I think is great. And by the way, you mentioned like peer support. There's the peer influence too, like when doctors, like you have a paid speaker, goes in front of a room and there's all these other doctors and they're pitching it and they buy into it. So it's part of the, so the power of the group is powerful and it can help you lose weight and balance your blood sugar too. So Dr. Fung, thanks again. This was a lot of fun. Really
Thank
appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Boom. All right. A lot of good
Fantastic.
stuff. Thank you.